Today I will talk about obscure Silent Hill games, starting with Silent Hill Orphan. Released in 2007, this mobile game actually tries to be survival horror, though of course that wouldn't be possible on a platform this limited, so it's a first-person point-and-click adventure instead. And honestly, that works surprisingly well. So let's take a closer look. The first thing we notice after selecting the language is... yeah, that's pretty much the extent of music in this game. And this same track also plays during gameplay sometimes, and trust me, it doesn't get any less obnoxious. That aside, you get a few sound effects like shooting here and there, but most of the game is actually completely silent. After encountering that... music? For the first time, we get the tutorial and a bit of story. We play as Ben, a survivor of a mass killing at his old orphanage 30 years ago, but for some reason he had an urge to come back? Sounds like a Silent Hill premise to me. While exploring, he encounters weird things like voices he hears, a man-sized hole in the wall covered by a grandfather clock, both of which he can't remember, and of course the other world. The story is actually pretty interesting, and I think about as good as it can get for such a limited platform. It's full of little twists and mysteries that I didn't expect and that had me guessing how they would be resolved. Like for example, Ben explaining that he was in the shower room while everyone was killed, but he can't remember why? And we can't enter the shower room because he feels like something bad would happen if we did? What's up with that? And there were more mysteries too, and all of them were genuinely interesting. It may not be the best story in this series, but surprisingly it's not the worst one either. And so we walk around the orphanage, solve puzzles, kill monsters, and try to uncover the mystery. What exactly happened here, and why did Ben decide to come back? The gameplay is pretty rudimentary, which is fair considering the platform and genre. It being a point-and-click adventure, you explore the areas, inspect things, pick up items, and generally just interact with things by clicking on them. You always have 4 options: look at, take or interact, taste or talk to, and check inventory, which, by the way, is the only way to check your inventory. Why? You sometimes get notes that you can only read by accessing your inventory, but in order to do that you have to interact with something? That's kinda dumb. And what about that tasting talking thing? You can try to lick everything, but by design this whole mechanic is used exactly once in this entire game, making me wonder why it exists in the first place. That aside, you also have to fight enemies sometimes, which is pretty basic and serves its purpose. The only problem here is that they all look the same, including the final boss. Though at least it's an original design, and not even a bad one. I just would have liked a little more variety, and while I'm at it, a little less predictability, because their locations aren't random, and after the first encounter, it's usually pretty easy to guess where they are. The last bit of gameplay is movement. It's pretty self-explanatory. You click wherever you want to go, including back. And you have to go back pretty often, which would be fine if the cursor didn't always start in the middle. So if you want to go back a lot, which you sometimes have to, especially if you don't know what to do, you always have to move it down, push, move down, push, move down. It's a little tiring. I did appreciate having to grab something out of a toilet though, giving me some real Silent Hill 2 flashbacks. But let's get back to the orphanage. The map, despite having 3 floors, is kinda small, but it's enough for the story it's trying to tell, and I'm glad that the game acknowledged how small it is, and actually explains that there were only 12 kids who still had to split into 2 groups when eating because the dining table wasn't big enough. That makes the whole place feel much more realistic, and depressing honestly. And in general, it seemed to be pretty miserable there. No personal belongings, no privacy even in the bathrooms, like damn. It's pretty well designed in my opinion, feeling almost like a haunted, lost place, and I love the creativity of having an orphanage as the main location of a game. We haven't really had that in survival horror before, and it's adapted beautifully. But looking at the map itself, there is one thing that kinda bothered me. All the passages are marked on the map from the beginning. In all other Silent Hill games, your map is empty, and as you explore and discover blocked paths, open doors, and other important things, your character will mark them on the map. That increases immersion a lot and gives the map much more meaning. All that is gone here. I knew right away which doors I can and can't go through, most of the time at least, because sometimes the things the map tells you aren't even true. Like this door, which is actually blocked despite the map telling you it's open, and it doesn't change even after you discover that it's blocked. And while I'm at it, what are these random blocked doors? Wouldn't it make sense for a map that I picked up on the ground floor of the orphanage to show all the rooms in the orphanage? Like, they don't have to be accessible, but it would have helped immersion to actually show them. As a Silent Hill fan, things like these feel like no-brainers. The map is an integral part in most of the games, including this one, and it's a bit of a shame that it wasn't integrated into gameplay in the same way. What was integrated into gameplay though, and can be seen as a problem because of that, is the other world. Just like in Silent Hill Origins, you can switch back and forth anytime by staring at the halo of the sun, and much like in Origins, the other world feels a bit like a puzzle element and not like an important story device sometimes. In the other games, as far as the characters are concerned, the world switches at random. It changes everything and you can't just leave. You have to push through. That makes the whole thing feel meaningful, whereas in Origins, it was turned into a pure puzzle element that you can switch to and from at any time. Go here, go to the other world, that opens up this path, then you can go back to the normal world here. It's by far not as bad in Orphan, and actually does feel meaningful in the second half, but in the first half, it did sometimes feel like more of a puzzle element. I hope that makes sense. But everything else the other world has to offer is beyond amazing in my opinion. It looks great, the normal orphanage feeling like a haunted place with some history, while the other world feels like a more twisted and in-your-face version of that, as it should. With puzzles, enemies, creepy environments, the whole package. Predictable enemy placements aside, they really outdid themselves here. Now, taking all of this into account, how did I find the game? It should be clear by now that it's far from perfect. There are things to criticize, and I mentioned many of them. But I'm not sure if I was able to bring across just how charming it really is, how amazing the locations look, and how interesting I found the story. Playing it was honestly a bit of a joy. Would I recommend it to literally anyone ever? No. But do I regret a single second I spent with it? Also no. Maybe it's just the feeling of playing something obscure within a bigger franchise, which I love, but I did have fun with it. So if you can look past the limitations, maybe this is something for you. It certainly was an interesting experience, and pretty short too. The only real problem is that it ends on a cliffhanger, so f me I guess. So, remember when I said that Silent Hill DX is referred to as mobile on the wiki? Well, here we have Silent Hill Mobile too. Except it's not a sequel to DX, it's a sequel to Orphan, released almost 1 year later. Amazing, right? Why they bother changing the name is beyond me. It doesn't take place at an orphanage anymore, I guess, but it is a direct sequel, and the orphans are still very much at the center of the story. Anyway, I'm just happy that the first game's cliffhanger was resolved after all, but let's start from the beginning. We are again greeted by the tutorial, and see that the one pointless interaction method, the mouth, is gone. The only other gameplay tweak, by the way, is that you can now turn left, right and back, instead of only ever facing one direction. In the corridors at least, not in the rooms. The rest is the exact same, down to the need to interact with something in order to access your inventory and read unrelated notes. I will never get over this. After the tutorial, you wake up in this bland, grey changing room as Lucas, a previously unknown character. You don't remember anything, but a certain Karen, a character from the first game, is talking to you telepathically. She's trying to make you remember, telling you things like your name, and speaks to you throughout the whole game. Your goal is to figure out what is going on, who you are, and what exactly Karen wants. And to do that you go through this hospital, look for clues, solve puzzles, and fight enemies. A true Silent Hill game, you might say. But one thing disappointed me right off the bat. Why a hospital? The orphanage was such a cool and creative setting. The only other Silent Hill game to feature one is the fourth one, and you're only there for like a minute. So having it as the main setting in Silent Hill Orphan was super interesting, and I hoped for more of that, or other creative settings. But hospitals are extremely common in the franchise, and this isn't even one we know, making me wonder just how many this town has. Also, why is it so tiny? At least with the orphanage the small size was explained, but a hospital? I'm not sure if it would be possible to explain that at all, but they didn't even try. And to then make it look this bland on top of that? I mean, all the corridors look the same. Even in the other world, they only got a reddish filter and nothing else changes. I really didn't like that. But at least the rooms here look really good, especially the first one with the dripping blood. They really outdid themselves here. By the way, you can enter the other world at any point again, except this time it's by staring at an upside down triangle? And the other world actually feels meaningful in this game. At no point did I think of it as a pure puzzle device, despite the ability to switch anytime. No idea how they managed that, but it's really cool. And so is the music compared to the first game at least. Not only do you get more tracks, most of them are actually okay. Nothing too special on its own, but given the first game's terrible sound design, it was very refreshing. Don't get me wrong, most of the game is still silent, but whenever you do get to hear some music, it's always different and always better than in the first game. The only track I didn't like is the one that plays when you switch back to the normal world. And not only does the game have more music, it also has more puzzles. Way more. I like that. Though there are sadly also some I didn't understand even after looking them up. Best case scenario would of course be to understand all of them, but I'd still take this over no puzzles. It just made it feel more like a survival horror game. Just like the battles. There are only 4 enemies in this entire game, 3 normal ones and the final boss, but the normal ones appear at such random places where you had just been before that they were way more unpredictable here. And I also like the abundance of locked doors, or generally things I had to find other things for to be able to progress. The map was also improved. While it is again completely marked from the beginning and doesn't change even when you open locked doors, and while having less accessible rooms than the first game, this one manages to feel bigger simply because there are more rooms on the map, even though you never even enter half of them. Having them on the map increases the perceived scale and immersion, and then some of the ones you do get to enter are also locked at first and often tied to puzzles for which you need other items or hints from other places. This is something the first game really lacked and I loved it. The only thing I didn't understand about the map is this dead end. And this one. But overall, everything about this game managed to feel even more like survival horror than the first one did. And by the time you reach the end, you will see that the story took a very different turn than you would expect. Arguably a more twisted one, with one of the plot points being someone trying to revive the murdered children from the orphanage. That was something. And it ends on a cliffhanger again, making me really excited for the third and last game. At this point I was so much into the story that I just needed to know how it concludes. Yet despite all of this, Silent Hill Mobile 2 left a bit of a bitter taste. The more generic setting and all the hallways looking the same, including in the other world, kinda bothered me. And that the normal world rooms look so bland. And that the story, while being an interesting and meaningful middle chapter, just doesn't have that sense of mystery the first game had. It's very twisted and takes turns you wouldn't expect, but the premise is amnesia, while the premise of the first game is a survivor of a mass killing returning to the orphanage where it happened 3 decades later. It's just much more intriguing and less cliché. And the first game also had more twists, and didn't go as over the top, still staying believable for a Silent Hill story, which I can't exactly say here. This one goes full supernatural, and I just didn't like that as much, on top of this game being noticeably shorter. The puzzles were more interesting here, and I liked the battles more, and the music. I liked playing it more, but there is more to a game than gameplay, and overall, I still prefer the first one. So let's see what the third and last one has to offer. Released 1.5 years after Silent Hill Mobile 2, Silent Hill Mobile 3 picks up right where it left off, I think. We're playing the same character, but the cliffhanger ending left his fate unclear, so because I don't know any better and the game isn't giving me any more, I'm just gonna assume that he passed out and woke up in this mansion. Oh yeah, this game takes place in a mansion, and it has more mysteries to uncover, but mainly revelations as the story comes to a close here. No to be continued, this is it. The honestly pretty satisfying finale where all remaining questions get answered, except for one. Apparently this takes place 40 years after the murders at the orphanage? What happened in the 10 years since the first game? When does the second game take place? Does this one really pick up right after the second one? I guess we'll never know. Starting the game, we get the best intro music yet. And in general, some okay sound design. It's mostly silent again, but we get some creepy sounds sometimes, but also some more annoying ones. It's not horrible and better than the first game, but I like the second game's sound design more. Anyway, after that first bit of music, we see that there is no tutorial this time. Guess they assumed that people would figure it out on their own, and honestly, it's not too hard to figure out. The design and UI were updated too, looking a bit more appropriate for a horror game now, but sacrificing some readability with that new font. And, probably the most important change, the on-screen arrow now moves faster. That must sound so random, but it makes navigation much smoother and backtracking, of which there is a lot if you don't know what to do, much less of a chore. Taking a look at the map, we immediately notice 2 things. 1, nothing is marked on it. Neither your location, though it's pretty easy to see where you are, nor the status of the doors. And it stays this way for the entire game. Kind of a shame, seeing how the map is such an integral part of most Silent Hill games, including this one. It just feels like a bit of its identity was stripped away. And 2, the elephant in the room. It doesn't look like a real map. more like a rough sketch you would make in Paint. And why are these dead ends a thing? There is literally nothing there. And why is the first floor split up like this? You can only access the left half with the stairs and the right half with the elevator from the second and third floor. That is so dumb. But at least every room is marked with something, unlike the second game, even if some aren't accessible, I guess. But really, this is supposed to be a mansion? I don't know. Map aside, the rooms themselves look really interesting, arguably the best designed rooms yet, but they are accompanied by some really bland and boring hallways. What is this series' problem with hallways? And you know what the worst thing is? The other world. The hallways are the exact same as in the normal world, and the differences in the rooms are really small, like blood on the walls. That was so disappointing. The first game had an amazing looking otherworld that felt incredibly faithful to the main games, and the second game's otherworld at least had some amazing looking rooms, but this one has nothing. Such a shame. The only real positive here, and it's a pretty big one, is that it always felt natural, never like a puzzle device, despite the switch happening manually again, with a symbol that I've never seen before. I love that. Overall, this game feels like a true finale. There are less puzzles than in the second one, and they're often really simple. Instead, we get more combat, with completely random feeling monster encounters, several monster designs, and a proper final boss. Pretty good for such a short game. It being less puzzle heavy and more focused on telling the end of the story and on the combat really makes it feel climatic at times. That, combined with the interesting story, twists, and surprising conclusion, makes for a really good final chapter. If you look stuff up, that is. Which I did. But if you don't, I wouldn't be surprised if you spend way too much time just mindlessly going through the rooms, because the game can be really bad at communicating what you have to do. So playing it without a guide would have made it pretty miserable, not gonna lie. But as is, it was a pretty enjoyable experience, with a length somewhere between the first two games, and I definitely liked it more than the second one. But the otherworld looks extremely lazy, and I like the first game's setting more. A mansion is cool, but an orphanage is just special, if you know what I mean. The map looked better in the first one, and I preferred the simple but mysterious story, which by now is still interesting, but neither simple nor mysterious. So my ranking would be Silent Hill Mobile 2 at the bottom, Mobile 3 in the middle, and Orphan on top.